Mayence. Now, Walter is perhaps someone who doesn't need an introduction, but let me just say that he's an expert in East Asian and Southeast Asian languages and has interests that cover typology and, of course, grammaticalization. So without further ado, let me hand you the microphone and you can serenade us.
Okay, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde et tout d'abord, bonjour à tout le monde. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici et d'avoir la chance de présenter quelques aspects de mes recherches linguistiques sur la grammaticalisation. Je continuerai donc en anglais puisque c'est la langue la plus générale, commune peut-être donc que l'on parle. Alors, je passe donc à l'anglais. So my talk is on grammaticalization and the question to what extent there is actually unity and to what extent there is diversity in grammaticalization phenomena as we can observe them. And for that purpose, I would like to start with some introductory remarks. So what I'm going to show you is a combination of two research questions. One of them, I will start introducing one of them with a classical quotation from Mayet, and the other one with another classical quotation from Gabelins' grammar on classical Chinese. So the first one is one which everybody knows. L'affaiblissement du sens et l'affaiblissement de la forme des mots accessoires vont de pair. But that's exactly the question. To what extent are they connected? To what extent is there an immediate interrelation? And I think the next bit is even more interesting in that quotation. Quand l'un et l'autre sont assez avancés, le mot accessoire peut finir par ne plus être qu'un élément privé de sens propre, etc., etc. Alors, quand l'un et l'autre sont assez avancés, what does assez avancé, sufficiently advanced, actually mean in that context? And I would like to elaborate on this based on my own data, or not only my own data, but on the data we worked on with our team. And the other one is from Georg von der Gabelins' Chinesische Grammatik, Chinese grammar of classical Chinese. And he states here in that part on die Kürze des Ausdrucks. Die Kürze des Ausdrucks zeichnet die Sprache aus. Die Sprache, this is classical Chinese in this context, vornehmlich den klassischen Stil. And then he goes on saying that alles andere, Numerus des Substantivs, Tempus und Modus des Verbums und was unsere Reflexionssprachen sonst noch ausdrücken müssen, bezeichnet das Chinesische nur dann ausdrücklich, wenn es sich nicht ohnehin aus dem Zusammenhang ergibt. So, well, yes, you have grammatical markers, but you don't use them if they are not necessary for reasons of context and for reasons of discourse. These are the two, this is the background of my presentation. But of course, then starting with Mayet, how does grammaticalization actually work in detail? For that purpose, we looked at 8 parameters, which we then tried to quantify, as I'm going to explain. And this is part of our MAGRAM project. And of course, then the question is, what does sufficiently advanced mean? And in that context, I'll briefly discuss 2 hypotheses, the parallel reduction hypothesis and the meaning first hypothesis. And then with regard to von der Gabelins, I would adopt his idea that grammars differ in the extent to which you actually have to use grammatical markers, even if they express grammatical categories, which are highly grammaticalized, at least from the perspective of the semantics they transport. And that's the second part of my presentation. Okay, a few words on parallel reduction hypothesis. Well, this is the idea that form changes or form change parallels meaning change. Sometimes one also talks about coevolution of meaning and form. Bybee and Dahl, Bybee et al. And Lehmann, for instance, may be mentioned in that context. And then on the other hand, you have the meaning first hypothesis, that is, meaning change is primary and precedes form change in time. It starts with pragmatic inference before it gets semantic and conventionalized. And then we have different models, for instance, the one by Heine et al., context model of grammaticalization, or invited inference theory of semantic change by Traugott and Dasher, and so on. Okay, so I will first present some results from the Mayence project, and then interactions between grammar and pragmatics and the lexicon. from the perspective of parallel reduction in meaning first, and cross-linguistic variation. So let's start with the results from our Magram project. This is the result which we've published in 2 volumes in Mouton de Gruyter, cross-linguistic variation in grammaticalization processes and areal patterns of grammaticalization. There's first a relatively large general introduction into the phenomena in which we also present our results. And then we have 28 chapters on individual languages, linguistic areas, and so on, and phenomena of grammaticalization. What we explicitly try to do is a quantitative analysis of grammaticalization. There are not so many. The prominent one is the one in 1994 by Bybee, Perkins, and Pagliuca, and some 30 years later, we tried to do something not the same, as you will see, but we also tried to define a general way of quantifying grammaticalization in our Mayence grammaticalization project, short Magram. We see our project as a first step, looking at the peak of the iceberg. So it's rather the beginning than the end of research on grammaticalization and quantification. Now, in a way, we did this in a typological manner, but then there are some differences between, let's say, normal typological research and research on grammaticalization. First of all, or one reason for why there are differences that need to be considered in methodology, the grammaticalization is not equally well attested cross-linguistically, and that might be, there might be 2 reasons for that. First, grammaticalization is really of minor importance in certain languages. It's not equally important across the world's languages, or there was grammaticalization, but its effects can no longer be seen in the data as they are accessible today. So, for instance, agreement markers, which are obviously there, but we don't know where they come from. And then also in terms of how to proceed, you cannot just read grammars or even do fieldwork on that topic. So one needs to talk to experts in the field. And that's why we cooperated with 29, with experts of 29 individual languages. They had 2 tasks. The one is that they contributed the chapter on existing grammaticalization pathways in their language. And then they also contributed to our database. And you can see here the languages. There are languages on Africa, Eurasia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and so on. So for instance, in Africa, we have Beja, Emai, Manding, Tswana, and then in Eurasia, starting with, that's alphabetical order, starting with Chinese, German to Yeniseian, and the other ones. These are the experts. I just briefly show the slides. I will not mention everybody, but Martin Haspelmark was part of this, for instance, and many other dear colleagues with whom we were cooperating. Now, to start with, we started out from Lehmann, 1995, 1982, with his idea of the autonomy of the linguistic sign. The more freedom with which a sign is used, the more autonomous it is. And here we already have this kind of coevolution of form and meaning, freedom that is tied, correlated to meaning, to form. Therefore, the autonomy of a sign is converse to its grammaticality, and grammaticalization detracts from its autonomy. Consequently, if we want to measure the degree to which a sign is grammaticalized, we will determine its degree of autonomy. Now, how do we do that? Well, Lehmann suggested, as you all know, 6 parameters. We changed the parameters in some ways for our presentation. So, for instance, the feature or the parameter of integrity, we split the parameter of integrity into its 2 parts, into its semantic part and into its phonetic part. So we argued that, after all, we are interested in effects that have something to do with meaning, and to what extent does meaning change affect form change. And for that reason, we split that into 2 parameters, namely semantic reduction on the one hand and phonetic reduction on the other hand. We accepted paradigmaticity, paradigmatic variability. What we excluded is structural scope, because that has been discussed as a problem in various approaches, so we didn't look at that. But then we included bondedness and syntagmatic variability, and we added two other frequently discussed parameters, namely decategorization and allomorphy. So these are the 8 categories. We actually were in discussion with Christian Lehmann on this topic, and he advised it as well. So there's a certain extent of cooperation here, to which I'm very grateful. Okay, so I will not present you all the parameters because we've described them, presented them in the questionnaire, which is the 2nd chapter of our volume. But I'll briefly look at semantic integrity, bondedness, and paradigmatic variability and obligatoriness. Partly also because some of the other presentations will address issues that have to do with that, for instance, bondedness, as we will probably hear later. Now, the idea is that you have a source and a target, and we established values of autonomy, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we had 4 different levels for source and target, for the source and the target, the result. We first calculated values for each parameter and each pathway. So we have individual paths that lead from source to target. And for each of them, as we will see, we have about 1,000 such pathways. We calculated values 1, 2, 3, 4 for the source and 1, 2, 3, 4 for the target. And ultimately, we were interested in 2 different aspects. Namely, first, we had a difference between the question of whether there is change or not. Did the parameter change its value from source to target? Yes, then we have plus. No, then we have minus, if there is a change. And on the other hand, we had, of course, we assigned individual values to the source and the target. So on the whole, we had 1,003 paths of grammaticalization. Combined with 8 parameters, we had for the 1, 2, 3, 4 for the value parameters, we had some 8,000 data points and another 8,000 points for the value data, which, well, so we have some 16,000 data points on the whole. Let me start with a remark before I get into more details, because determining different values for individual parameters is not easy. We spent more than a year trying to and through all sorts of languages and data before we finally came up with our quantification. But of course, that is still just, as always in this case, debatable up to a certain extreme. Let me start with parameter 1 on semantic integrity. So the value 1 was assigned if the linguistic sign has a lexical meaning. Value 2, if the linguistic sign has an abstract meaning, but it is still referential. We've discussed that yesterday as well in some context. The meaning is still referential or denotational rather than relational. Value 3 is for linguistic signs which have an abstract, non-denotational, non-referential meaning. And value 4 is if the linguistic sign has a syntactic function, for instance, if it has become a case marker. An example here would be a lexical item like head, which then, if it means something like on top of something, then you would assign it to value 2. If it's a semantic, if it stands for a semantic case, it gets value 3, and value 4 if it has developed into a case marker. So for instance, this Thai example here where we have lang, which means back, lang ban, then this would mean here back, he be at back house, he's behind the house. So we would assign value 3 here. And a very nice example is the suffix ko in Hindi, Urdu, which can be traced back to kaksa, side and place. And you can see here one example from Animoto's paper. So aims, arrow, hell, ku. Here, this ku, which is the shortened form of kaksa. He aims his arrow at the netherworld, which is still allative. But here, it has become a case marker. Let's call it accusative here, and strikes the sky. So then this ku marker has become and we would get the value 4 in this context. Parameter 4, bondedness. The linguistic sign is a free morpheme, value 1. The linguistic sign is eclectic. Combination is not limited to a single word class, for instance, so we would get it value 2. The linguistic sign is an agglutinative affix, and the linguistic sign is part of a portmanteau morpheme or an extra segmental, for instance, tonal element, or an ablaut element, or even a 0 element. Paradigmatic variability, the famous obligatoriness, as we heard yesterday in Eric's paper. Here we basically follow Lehmann's conceptualization that you have a certain grammatical domain, a certain grammatical category, and then you have to you have to use a certain value. So you have tense, and then you have to use past or future or whatever your language needs in that context. And here again, we just try to define this phenomenon, but not necessarily with regard to grammaticalization as such, but rather with regard to possible ways in which one can grade obligatoriness in different environments. So if there is no obligatoriness at all, everything is just subject to pragmatic inference, then there is no obligatoriness. But sometimes there is obligatoriness in a limited or small set of clearly defined constructions. So for instance, the marker is not obligatory, is value 1, but if you have a plural marker and it is only used for pronouns and maybe kinship terms, but nothing else, small domains, we would assign it value 2. Value 3, the linguistic sign is obligatory in most contexts. So for instance, plural marker is obligatory for all count nouns, except, let's say, non-specific nouns, and a few exceptions, as we always have them in such grammaticalized systems, we would assign value 3. And if the linguistic sign is generally obligatory in a certain environment, so for instance, all count nouns need a plural marker, get a plural marker, then we would assign it value 4. So what we then did, we had the language here, we had some other indications of, and then we had a table here in which we added the values for semantic integrity, phonetic reduction, and so on. And that's the table as it looked like. Of course, the whole thing is an Excel table, which is much larger, and I didn't want to project that onto my slides. This would take a lot more space. So then, well, yes, first results. First of all, we looked at patterns. In a way, you can now align the pluses and minuses, so of course also the values for each parameter. So a language might have plus. So there was change from target to from source to target in the first parameter, namely syntactic integrity, but not in the second parameter, third parameter, and this creates patterns. On the whole, you have 2 to the power of 8, that is 256 patterns, mathematically possible patterns. And we just checked the frequency of these individual patterns. And here is something very interesting or remarkable occurred. So we just, for instance, the pattern that is most frequent, covering a bit more than 20% of all the patterns we had, was of that type. So plus, that is change for semantic integrity, no change for phonetic reduction, change for paradigmaticity, and so on. So this pattern here, as it can be seen here, is attested in about 20% of our 1,000 pathways we looked at. The next one is also quite frequent, and these are the 5 most frequent patterns which cover almost 50% of our data. And what is remarkable is, just as a first impressive impression, in all 5 of these most frequent patterns, we find that there is semantic integrity there's change in semantic integrity, which is probably to be expected, of course. But what is probably not so much to be expected, but what showed up here is that we, in all 5, we also have PM paradigmaticity, which is always plus through the 5 values, and then syntagmatic variability as well. But interestingly enough, phonetic reduction and allomorphy, they don't seem to care much, or they don't seem to matter in this context. So what we then have, we have the prominence of semantic integrity, parametricity, and word order, morpheme order semantic variability, which are of particular importance. So consistent plus values again here for semantic integrity, paradigmaticity, syntagmatic variability, and consistent minus values for phonetic reduction and allomorphy. We then did heat maps where we used Kendall's tau 0.3, which is generally used for distinguishing something like moderate to strong correlations. And we did this separately for plus and minus data and for the individual values. And what we see is somehow similar. So here we have semantic integrity, and we now want to see in comparison to correlation with phonetic reduction, paradigmaticity, and so on, to what are the tau values for this. And one can see that again, there's a relatively high value between semantic integrity and paradigmaticity, semantic integrity and word order, morpheme order, and additionally with decategorization. But then there are also other ones. So for instance, phonetic reduction and bondedness, which have not so much to do with semantics, but they correlate. And the same for paradigmaticity and word order, and here for decategorization and word order. So the summary here again, we have, let's say, our dear friends, semantic integrity, paradigmaticities, and word order, which again correlate tightly, and here in addition decategorization, and we have some more form-oriented factors which also show high values. That was the plus-minus part. And of course we can now look or do the same for values 1, 2, 3, and 4, and how they do in this ranking in this comparison of rankings. And here what we see is again, that the figures are even higher sometimes here. So the differences which I've shown are more prominent, more pronounced. So what you have here, for instance, is again a relatively high value for sorry, that was too quick, was a relatively high value for semantic integrity and paradigmaticity and syntagmatic variability. So these are again high, and particularly high values here in the context of parametricity, so paradigmaticity. So here we have, for instance, bondedness and paradigmaticity, obligatoriness and paradigmaticity, and morpheme order. And the most pronounced one, which is doesn't come as a surprise actually, if you have high values for bondedness, then of course that it reduces the flexibility of word order. So that would be to be expected, of course, and we really have a high value of almost 0.7 here in this context. If one summarizes all this, of these two heat maps in figures 1 and 2, as I said, we get the reconfirmation of PM and syntagmatic variability cooperating with semantic integrity. We have the more pronounced correlations here. If I compare again this one here, bondedness, where we have paradigmaticity here, we have some of the values, but if you go to the other ones, here this is stronger. So we have relatively high values, as I said, for bondedness, paradigmatic variability, and syntagmatic variability. And of course, the strong correlation between variability, syntactic word order, and bondedness is to be expected. Moreover, bondedness seems to show certain correlation between the two realms that we were able to develop. Because on the one hand, if we look at this chart here, what we can see here is that the thicker arrows, they are for those correlations which apply to the plus and minus values, as well as to the 1, 2, 3, 4 values. And one can see that semantics, semantic integrity, paradigmaticity, and syntagmatic variability, word order, they are strongly correlated. They form a little cluster among themselves on the one hand. And then we have bondedness, for which there is a correlation with phonetic reduction and allomorphy. But then allomorphy and phonetic reduction, if they are linked in one way or another, if one would want to link them in one way or other to meaning change, then this is only indirectly. Of course, we did some other tests, or we are doing some other tests for finding out more about directedness at the moment, but because this is work in progress or being in under review, I will not report on this that much, but still these two areas seem to be somehow robust. And then there are certain parameters like bondedness, which is kind of bridge between the more function related parameters, these three here, and the form related parameters here. You can see that there is that we have some correlation effects between paradigmaticity and bondedness, and between word order, morpheme order, and bondedness, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in that sense, then we can see quite a lot. What we did in addition is actually that we looked at in some more details at the heat maps, and we had some binary correlations in change for plus and minus values, in the sense that if phonetic reduction changes to plus, or the change of phonetic reduction took place if semantic integrity changed as well, for instance, on one hand. And then for the value level related correlations, there was a certain dependency between change in one parameter and a higher level for another parameter. So for instance, phonetic reduction changes got a plus if semantic integrity had levels 3 or 4. So then there, but it's not that simultaneously. So I mean, the semantics need to be bleached to a certain extent before you can see this effect. Well, we also did multidimensional scaling and a few other tests, and they somehow seem to, they confirm what we've seen here more impressionistically. If I briefly comment from this on these two hypotheses, the parallel reduction hypothesis and the meaning first hypothesis, one can see that form change parallels meaning change. Yes, to a certain extent, if we think of semantic integrity and paradigmaticity and syntagmatic variability, but maybe not for the prototypical form-related ones. And that is probably more remarkable in a way. And then meaning first hypothesis, so meaning change is primary and precedes form change. Yes, in the sense that the change in semantic integrity does not necessarily affect all parameters equally. And for instance, that example with phonetic reduction, that changes most of the time in correlation with higher values 3 and 4 for phonetic reduction. But of course, there is no direct evidence for effects of pragmatic inference that is beyond what one can do in such an analysis. Okay, so this was the first part of my presentation, in which we tried to see to what extent different parameters cooperate or do not cooperate, co-vary with these grammaticalization projects in a traditional way, starting out from Lehmann's approaches without looking at the constructionalizations and phenomena like that. So maybe one can still do quite some research in this field, and there are still quite a lot of questions that are open and that are interesting. Now let's look at the second question, which I was presenting in the context of von der Gabelen's idea of the shortness of expression of economy, or whatever, as we will see in a minute, interactions between grammar, pragmatics, and the lexicon, as I call it here. Well, we've just seen that we have 8 parameters and that they cluster in 2 zones, function related and form related, and that within each of these 2 domains, there are characteristic changes going on, which are purely zone internal and don't go beyond that. And then we've also seen that there is a certain correlation between higher values of semantic integrity and phonetic reduction. Looking at that, this leaves a certain leeway in the extent to which function and form co-vary. And the question is there, for instance, some typological variation there? To what extent do languages tend to be, let's say, more form meaning correlated than others? And in that context, I have done a lot of work on questions of complexity. And in that context, I distinguish between 2 different types of complexity, depending on, on the selection or non-selection of grammatical information in concrete utterances in discourse. So the idea is, if one looks at what is normally discussed in typology, you look at form and you see certain patterns, and then you describe these patterns in terms of complexity. You have more grammatical distinctions, for instance. For instance, you have tense, and in one language you have 3 distinctions, in the other you have 2. And that means that the language with 3 distinctions is more complex than the language with 2 distinctions, and so on and so forth. This is based on obligatoriness in the sense that the grammar of a language X forces the speaker to encode a certain grammatical category that exists in X. So, for instance, in a given morphosyntactic environment. So, for instance, I would never say that, of course, that even, I go on with that later. So obligatory, that's the definition of obligatoriness and how overt complexity might be addressed in this context. And the idea is that a marker expresses a specific value of a grammatical domain. In the case of hidden complexity, you prototypically have non-obligatoriness, that is, the grammar of a language marks a grammatical category, but does not enforce its encoding if it can be inferred. So, for instance, and that is important because I sometimes was asked how I think about it. If a language doesn't have evidential, then I would not say that there is hidden complexity with regard to evidentiality in that language. I would only say that there is hidden complexity with regard to evidentiality in that language if the language has markers for that. And then we often have multifunctionality in the sense that a marker has more than one function belonging to different domains of grammar, but not in the sense of accumulation, but in one context, the grammatical marker has, let's say, the meaning of a definiteness marker, and in another context, the same marker addresses issues of indefiniteness and things like that. And the idea is that we have 2 motivations, competing motivations in a way, explicitness and Deutlichkeitstrieb, for instance, in terms of von der Gabelen's. But of course, von der Gabelen's had some other ideas behind it, as we've just discussed, but I make use of this in terms of economy. So you are not economic, you address a certain grammatical domain explicitly because you feel that it's necessary, and you have economy, which is the Bequemlichkeitstrieb in German, and they both are, well, competing, and that leaves a certain space, gives you a certain space of variation, of typological variation in terms of grammaticalization. And my idea is that East and mainland Southeast Asian languages show high degrees of hidden complexity in many different domains of grammar. So, of course, hidden complexity is first of all related to individual grammatical domains, but once languages do this in different domains over and over again, so one might probably start generalizing up to a certain extent that the languages generally show a higher degree of hidden complexity. That is, they leave the inference, they leave the information provided by a certain grammatical category to the pragmatic inference of the hearer. And I've been working on tense aspect, number, definiteness, indefiniteness, clause combining, pronominals based on kinship terms, and a few other ones in which you will find again and again the same pattern of hidden complexity. You have markers, but their selection, their use depends on discourse rather than on fixed grammatical rules. The languages, just briefly, so Sinitic or Chinese with Mandarin, Cantonese, and so on, Austroasiatic, basically with Mon Khmer and Vietnamese, and thank you, and Thai Kadai, Thai, for instance, Hmong Mien languages, the Miao Yao in Chinese, and then Austronesian in Chamic, at least in some Austronesian languages, particularly Chami in the central, at the coast of central Vietnam, you have some Austronesian languages which follow similar patterns. So for illustrating what I mean, I start with a very famous marker of Chinese. Maybe everybody already heard about the famous la, which is one of the most well-studied grammatical phenomena in Chinese linguistics. And it is generally described in one way or another in terms of as a perfective marker. But in this case, we even have loss of phonological substance, phonetic reduction, because the full verb was something like liao, but now it's only la. But even this marker is not obligatory in many contexts, where, for instance, if you make tests for the typical prototypical tests for spectrality, like for instance sequentialization, two events, the first one has to reach its terminal boundary before the next one can start. And in this context, you would normally have to use an aspect marker, a perfective aspect marker, as is well known, but not in Chinese. So for instance, this is just one example. There are, of course, many others here. You have, well, I probably better read the English translation first, because then you see more about the contextual, the domains here. So Hua Laoshan suddenly sat up in bed, so he was lying in bed. He struck a match, lit the grease-covered oil lamp, and then in the two rooms of the tea house, a ghostly light was shed. Probably this even fits a bit into the atmosphere of this room. I don't know. Anyway, but there is a certain tension, you see. So the man, Hua Lashan Hu Ren Zuo Qi Shen, so he sits up, but there is no la here. With this, I don't take this zero so seriously. I just want to point out the fact that there is no la in this context. So he then strikes a match, and then there's a more complex sentence, and then he lights up the grease-covered lamp. Finally, the light filled the room with a slightly kind of ghostly light. But there is, as I said, there is a tension. So we have a sequence of events, and the climax of it is reached in the final one. This is here when something ghostly, something strange, something remarkable happened. And it is in this particular situation at the climax of these events only that you use the perfective marker la. Now, well, I've said la is not obligatory, But if we look at viewpoint aspect, the distinction between viewpoint aspect and situation aspect in terms of Smith, for instance, one can see, and here I follow Li Wendan's paper, that there are, of course, a lot of lexically based bounding expressions as well. So, for instance, you have resultatives. So you have your first verb, and then you have a second verb which tells you about the result that has been reached. So you can, you look, and the result is 清楚, clearly. So you see clearly, or 学, learn, and 会, to know, 学会, so you learn in the sense that you reach the state of knowing now, and so on and so forth. And of course, you have event quantification, you have coverb phrases, and everything else. So the interesting thing now is that the perfective marker le addresses viewpoint aspect, which is grammatical, and we have lexical aspects as well, bounding expressions, which can be equal to situation aspect and are lexical. And if we look again at our example here, so these are the lexical parts. Here you have 坐, sit, and 起, up, giving you the direction. Or here we have 擦, to strike, and 着, as a result, burn. Or you have 点, to light, and 成 is the result in the sense that this is positive. So this was a success story. You managed to light up. And interestingly enough, these blue resultative markers in this context, they have to be there. So you cannot omit that part, even though in principle, it is perfectly grammatical to say 坐, 坐了, it's sat down or something like that, but not in this context. In this context, it's necessary to set the boundaries, but in a lexical way and not in a grammatical way. And the lexical way seems to be enough very often. So then, lexical aspect is sufficient. And in that sense, I would say obligatory, because at least these finite sentences or sequences of events would be strange, if not ungrammatical, if you wouldn't use the resultatives here. And Li then goes on showing that what determines the use of this marker is actually foregrounding and sometimes backgrounding, and some other details into which I will not go at the moment. But what is important is, in a language with obligatory grammatical aspect distinctions, grammatical aspect interacts with lexical aspect, but it cannot be used independently for purposes of these two perspectives of aspect cannot be used independently. They are always combined. Whereas in Chinese, or in this marker in this particular case, you have one part with it, which is lexical, Aktionsart, and so on. And these are lexical expressions. You have, in fact, as you've seen, you have a lot of different lexical material, which you can put in here. And there are lexical restrictions. This is not productive. It has to be known up to a certain extent what you have to do here. There is lexical arbitrariness up to a certain extent that comes in here. So on the one hand, the lexical expression of abstract aspect is neatly divided from discourse aspect. And so given that lexical expressions are already enough for triggering the inference that the final boundary has been reached, you can use le for discourse purposes. And that is what seems to happen in Chinese. So discourse decides about use or non-use of le for purposes of foregrounding and backgrounding, whereas there are lexical aspects, given that there is a rich inventory of lexical means for expressing situation aspect. So pragmatics remain relevant at later stages of the diachronic development, because you only somehow implicitly, lexically mark aspect, but then you can use your aspect marker le for purposes of discourse, and discourse remains important. And for that reason, there's a certain difference of labor between grammar on the one hand and morphology and the lexicon on the other hand. Another example, and I think this is important if one looks at morphology, I think in many, of course, these so-called isolating languages are not always that isolating. Some of them really do have morphology. And a very interesting case in point is Waning Ahmau, which is a Hmong-Mien language. And what that language actually has is some kind of classifier inflection. So you have a classifier, and now that classifier takes on different forms depending on whether the form is definite or indefinite. And then the system is also associated with augmentative, medial, and diminutive size. So for instance, this is the point of departure. You have a classifier with the structure consonant, vowel, tone. So in this case, we have lu. Its indefinite form for augmentative would be mid-level tone, lu, lu. And then you have vowel change here. For the definite medium size, you would have I with this tonality, lu, lai, and you have la for the diminutive. And in the indefinite, in the case of indefiniteness, you would, as you can see here, have other tonalities occurring. So you have a pattern of 6 different forms of the classifier for singular, and you have the same for plural, but I don't present you the plural here. So we have 12 different markers. So for instance, here you have tu, nyo, the ox, which is the classifier in its augmentative definite singular form, the ox, and you have classifier in definite singular, an ox. So you see here the classifier differs. And the same also for quantifiers, or for mass nouns like group. So the noun for group is here ka, which means the group of people, and kwa, a group of people. Now, of course, now that looks like a prototypical kind of article system, which is a bit more complex, but even in Waning Ahmau, and I'll finish in 2 or 3 minutes, the criteria for using classifier are still subject to pragmatic inference. So we have classifiers are not always used. So foregrounding, for instance, is interesting. What we've observed is that protagonists occur very often and obligatorily with a classifier. And you use the classifier in contrasting topic. Animate elements preferable, but not always get the classifier, and relationality as well. Just to give you, and then that's the conclusion, the conclusive example, the story of the man with a hat. So there is a man who is selling hats. He feels tired in the forest somewhere, so he sits down, puts his back somewhere and falls asleep. And then the monkeys come, they rub all his hats. And then when the man gets up again, he is surprised that there are no hats anymore. He looks on the trees and he sees the monkeys making all sorts of stupid things with his hats. And because of that, he gets nervous, he gets furious, he wants to get back his hats. And he gets so furious that he throws his hat down to the floor. The monkeys imitate him, and that's how he gets back his hats. That's the idea. But now, how is this expressed? So the story starts with there was. So there was one classifier, mediate indefinite man. Later on, the man is taken up again now by a different classifier, but that has something to do with gender, actually, because once an individuum has been introduced, then you use, if it's a man, you switch to another classifier here, and you can see, but here the classifier is now definite, has its definite form, whereas here it has its indefinite form. But then there are many nouns, like for instance, the birds, which are there in the forest. The wind was blowing, so the wind is green here, and it doesn't have a classifier at all. And there was also all sorts of birds. The birds have no classifier here. They are duplicated. And then the man gets a classifier. Later on, the sun gets one. Here, the man again, when he is mentioned again, gets again his definite classifier form here. The basket is introduced and later on gets its classifier for definiteness. and so on and so forth. So what one can see, not every noun does get the classifiers, the selection of it. We don't have so many data on this, but as far as one can see, there are similar tendencies as I've observed in cooperation with a student on Vietnamese. There are similar factors that seem to trigger the use or non-use of a classifier, depending on context. So again, we have classifiers. Discourse decides of whether you to use them or not. And then if you look at the lexical side of it, you really have a large inventory of different classifiers, and you have to select one of them, which of course then also specifies the specific properties of a given concept in a given situation. So then again, you can see this was just one more example for how form and meaning cooperate. What I wanted to show you is that grammaticalization in that traditional sense, lexical items becoming grammatical items, if we take grammaticalization seriously by that definition, as Elena Smirnova pointed out last time as well. If that remains relevant, there is still a lot of things to do, even though Neumeyer pointed out that this might not be interesting at all. So we have covariation between different parameters in interesting ways. That needs, of course, further research. And we seem to have different divisions of labor, particularly in languages which are prone to hidden complexity. And that is what I wanted to show. Thank you.
I'm sure we have lots of questions and about 10 minutes for these. Yes. I can see people twitching with their hands.
Thank you very much for this really great, rich talk. I have a question about the hidden complexity as a kind of holistic language type. So you pointed out that Chinese and other mainland East Asian languages have, you rely on inference, not only in tense and aspects, which you pointed out, but also in other areas of grammar. And my question is, how could we understand this? I mean, you have probably speculated on this in your work, but in your talk you didn't really say so. So there's some three ways I can think of. One is that there's something about the culture, the mentality, the temperament, and perhaps 19th century linguists would say of these people, that is sort of old-fashioned. We probably don't have this kind of language ideology anymore. Okay. So we can leave that aside and maybe only discuss it in the coffee break. But the other two are that it's purely accidental, so that you could have, for example, in like 5 different domains, a language that has optionality in all 5. One that has optionality only 4, one only 3, one none, and so on. And it's just random, and the similarities between these East Asian languages are just areal effects, so they influence each other. And so that's why they just happen to have 0, 0, 0, 0 on all 5 points, and it's purely accidental. And then the final one, perhaps the most interesting one, is that there's some causal factor that causes languages to show hidden complexity in other domains when they have hidden complexity in some domains. So like a dependent order, some people have suggested that the ordering of the head and dependent sort of cause each other to be harmonious. That there's some factor that makes language have more harmony and thus to allow more efficient language use or so. And I was just thinking about this while you were talking. I haven't heard anyone suggesting this harmony explanation for the uniformity of hidden complexity in East Asian language. So my hunch would be it's accidental, but what do you think? My hunch is also that it is in a certain way accidental,
But then of course, there are different aspects. There is language contact, which is quite frequent across different multilingualism and across different things. Probably not so much nowadays, but in the past, for instance, there was a huge and intensive historical contacts in between Thai and Khmer. You can see that immediately the languages are so similar in regard to many grammatical features, but not with regard to the lexicon. And there are clearly well-attested centuries of intensive contact, also politically motivated and so on, and in others as well. So it's a very complex and intricate situation of contact that leads to that. But in a more general way, my statement would somehow be that you have two ways of accretion or of one way of creating complexity is, let's say, the accumulation of all sorts of complicated morphological patterns, loss of markers, as it was described in Dahl, for instance, Dahl's book on complexity. But my saying is, this is only one way of how a language can become more mature. It accumulates all sorts of things across time. Another way of accumulating is not accumulating, but being in a one way, in some way economic. So economy can also be a very strong drive in the sense that even if you have markers, you don't use them if they are not necessary. But once you get into the situation of having to use a marker, then the complexity comes in, because the system that is behind is the lexical elements that you have to select from. You want to count and you have to use a classifier, and there are 50 classifiers. You have to select one. And that is the accumulation in an economy-based pattern of processes. But then this is, first of all, an instance that happens in individual grammatical domains, first of all. But it seems that languages can do this up to a certain extent across a large number of different grammatical domains, of different across different categories. And I think then one has to dig further into these friends and into the, where do we have them? Into this area. They are also somehow correlated among each other. And they probably don't even care so much about meaning. There are morphophonological processes. And for instance, if one looks at ever so many of the languages I'm working with, you have very strong syllabic structures. And then I would argue that there is also a certain link from below, as I call it, from phonology, probably even phonetics phonology. One can see that in the development of tones. You have your distinctions, but you have your restrictions on the syllables. So tones are generated. You have seen the rather complex situation here in that morphology of waning Ahmao. So it's just that on the formal side, languages are different. Of course, this is all tentative, and not tentative, but there are always exceptions in languages, also in mainland and East and mainland Southeast Asian languages. In some Semitic languages, you have obligatory case marking, for instance, and so on and so forth. So such things do exist in these languages, but there is a strong tendency towards the dominance of economy, but it's a mixed pattern that consists of a lot of different factors, contact, phonology, and so on. And of course, then these general two types of complexity. And as I said, East and mainland Southeast Asian languages are old languages with an enormously rich tradition, of course. But they accumulate their complexity in different places. They accumulate it in the lexicon, but not so much in the way in what you have to say overtly. Here, the languages offer more options for economy than other languages do. Yeah, that's probably what I can say.
I have a question. Oh, mentally. I can ask a question over the coffee break.
Thank you very much. The discussion of the discourse function reminds me of the pragmatic markers, discourse markers. So would you say that perhaps the class of pragmatic markers in languages like Chinese is bigger than we know from European languages? I'm familiar with East Asian languages myself, but I'm aware of studies of discourse markers in Chinese Mandarin. And we seem to behave or show the same functions or similar functions as in European languages. And what you say really corresponds to what I know about that.
No, these pragmatic markers, they are there. There are quite a lot of them, and they are currently very well studied. And there are some interesting aspects. For instance, this the famous sentence final particles. And of course, they provide a lot of information concerning stance and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing is, on the one hand, yes, I would also compare them to discourse particles, but then you can conjoin them. And there, for instance, I've recently read a very interesting dissertation where you can see there is word order there. So if you have more than one, there are clear patterns of ordering. And Thai is particularly famous probably for that. And there are also some good papers which show in which order these markers have to occur. And in fact, here, at least in discourse, they are so frequent that while I would not tend to say that they are obligatory, but it's just the situation that you have to add some edges or some limitations of stance, or to address your stance towards something. And that's important, but still it's just ultimately more pragmatic than a rigid system. And that is, of course, also reminds me a bit of what we've heard about obligatoriness. So often people use them, and it depends of course, on the discursive relation between speaker and hearer and so on. But then you use it,
So you make a distinction between pragmatic markers in Chinese and the rather discourse-related grammatical patterns.
I would still make that difference. I would still make that difference. They are not at the same level.
This would be interesting also for what you know about discourse markers.
No, I think they can clear, and I mean it's like ever so often they can have many different functions as well, which I mean discourse markers which are hard to grasp. Whereas, I mean, a perfective marker is a perfective marker, but still its use is somehow different. I would say semantically corresponds to what we generally understand by a perfective marker, but it doesn't behave like a well-behaved. No, sorry, I shouldn't say that. It doesn't behave like what is described in traditional studies on aspect and how it is. And obligatoriness, and that makes tests for aspecthood very difficult because they are not obligatory.
And perhaps a second thought, and that what you say also reminds us of earlier stages of grammaticalization, when you still have expressive functions related to the item. For instance, in French, verbal periphrasy is expressing progressivity, which are not obligatory, and which also serve a foregrounding function.
You said earlier stages, and that's the important thing. I think in this case, it's no longer earlier. It's just there. And that's that's actually my difference between hidden and overt complexity. If you have hidden complexity, you probably don't get into that next dimension, or it's not so likely that you get into it. There must be something that blocks it. I cannot pinpoint it. I mean, we are coming back to Martin's question here. It's hard to pinpoint all of that. And it's also difficult to do statistics on that. That's another thing. I was asked often, why, for instance, if you talk about radical product, why don't you just make statistics about it? Well, you open a book and you see it. I mean, it's not necessary. And if you do statistics, you blur all the important conditions under which you then use these markers for particular purposes, discourse, up to poetic and whatever. I mean, these things talking about aesthetics, for instance, Ezra Pound discusses Chinese and a certain type of Chinese poetry from the perspective of only using content words and no grammatical words in a poem. And there is a certain, there are certain poetic styles in tongue and poetry, for instance, where this has been followed easily given the system of the grammar, and probably not so easily in English, where you don't have this. So there are, of course, also these ramifications, but they are not so important for me in the sense, but all of that has its ramifications and consequences, which is ultimately making it very hard to do statistics in a way that really provide you information on how these markers are used. You can certainly, I would bet that you can characterize individual authors up to a certain extent by counting how frequently they use certain markers or how frequently they don't use it and things like that in a combined way. But for understanding how the grammar works, it's probably not so helpful.
Okay, all right. So we've had extraordinarily good timekeeping at this conference, and I think we should maintain that tradition. We're not going to break it on my watch. So let's go to the coffee break and discuss this further there. And we will come back here punctually at 11, or we'll start at 11. So you'll have to already be in your seats.
Thank you.
Are the presentations for the next